At 7:30 hours on March 15, 1945, the war in Europe felt a world away from the railway station in Somerset, England. Here, the morning mist softened the landscape into an impressionist painting of rolling hills and stone-walled fields. 4 Oberfeldwebel Carl Hoffman and the 23 other German prisoners of war disembarking from a truck, this pastoral scene was deeply unsettling. Exhausted from the long journey from their camp in Yorkshire, they shuffled into a loose formation, a knot of shared uncertainty. For 18 months, their experience in British captivity had systematically dismantled the dire warnings of Nazi propaganda. Yet this new directive, to live and work on civilian farms, far from the relative predictability of barbed wire, felt like a perilous step into the unknown. Their apprehension was palpable. Whispers in German rippled through their ranks, a current of fear fueled by questions of what awaited them among the local populace. Would they be met with hatred? Would this be where the true punishment began? Their silent anxieties were interrupted by a middle-aged British corporal, a man whose weathered face spoke of a war spent in unglamorous but essential duties. In accented but clear German, he laid out the terms of their new existence. An 8-hour day, 6 days a week, performing whatever agricultural labor their assigned farmer required. Fair treatment was promised to those who worked hard. A swift return to camp and disciplinary action awaited any who caused trouble. When he called for questions, only silence answered. Consulting his clipboard, the corporal began reading out assignments. Hoffman, Meadowbrook Farm, he announced, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson. Soon after, a civilian lorry arrived, its bed laden not with military equipment, but with the tools of cultivation. At the wheel was a woman of perhaps 50, her practical clothes and Wellington boots marking her as their new supervisor. She regarded the prisoners assigned to her with an expression Carl could not decipher. It was not hostile, but it offered no welcome. It was the cautious, measuring gaze of someone assessing former enemies who were now, by the strange fortunes of war, to become her workforce. As they drove through a countryside impossibly serene and untouched by the ruin Hoffman had known since 1939, the war itself seemed to recede, becoming a distant, abstract horror. For the German prisoner of war, Carl, the pastoral English landscape felt profoundly dislocated from the conflict he knew, a war that had leveled cities and claimed the lives of British soldiers fighting men just like him. As their transport rounded a bend, Meadowbrook Farm came into view, a solid stone farmhouse with a slate roof, surrounded by outbuildings and fields stretching to the horizon. In the yard, a man was repairing a fence. Lean and grey-haired, he moved with the deliberate efficiency of a lifetime of physical labor. This was Mr. Patterson. He straightened as the group approached, studying the 3 German prisoners with the same cautious measure his wife had shown. After a rapid exchange in English that Carl could not follow, Mr. Patterson nodded slowly. He turned to the prisoners and, in broken German, delivered the stark terms of their new reality. Work. Good treatment. Bad work. No work. Understand. As they were being led to the barn, a simple act unfolded that defied the logic of war. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the house carrying a tray with 3 mugs. She called out, and her husband stopped. She then handed a mug to each prisoner. It was tea, hot, with milk and sugar, luxuries Carl had not tasted in years. The offering was without ceremony, but also without hostility. He held the warm ceramic, trying to comprehend the gesture. Britain and Germany were still at war. The Pattersons could have a son fighting on the continent. Yet here they stood, offering comfort to the enemy. Sensing his confusion, Mrs. Patterson managed a few simple English words. A long day, she explained, meant that work was better with tea. It was not a grand act of forgiveness, but an expression of profound British pragmatism. In that moment, as he drank, Carl understood that the reality of his captivity would be far more complicated than any propaganda had prepared him for. This system of agricultural labor, this unexpected civility, was born not of sentiment, but of dire necessity. By 1944, Britain faced a severe agricultural labor shortage, as over 500,000 farm workers had been called into military service or war industries. With its own manpower conscripted for military service or diverted to vital war industries, Britain faced a catastrophic labor shortage on the home front. The nation's food supply hung precariously in the balance, dependent on domestic agriculture and the perilous Atlantic convoys. Without enough hands to bring in the harvest, crops would rot in the fields, threatening the very security of the island nation. An unlikely, and for many, an unwelcome solution presented itself in the vast network of prisoner-of-war camps, which by 1945 held over 400,000 German and Italian captives. To leave such a workforce idle was a waste the country could not afford. Sanctioned by the Geneva Conventions, which permitted the employment of prisoners in agricultural work, the logic was brutally straightforward. Use the available enemy manpower to maintain food production while British men fought overseas. The War Agricultural Executive Committees, known as the War Ags, coordinated the assignment of prisoners to farms. Yet this was more than a logistical challenge. It required a profound social adjustment. Farmers, many of whom had lost sons in the fighting, had to accept former enemy soldiers onto their land. Communities, scarred by the Blitz, had to tolerate Germans living and working in their midst. A deep-seated British pragmatism, however, ultimately triumphed over animosity. The need to keep the country fed mattered more than holding a grudge. This was not about forgiveness. It was a stark calculation of survival. For men like Carl Hoffman, this grand national strategy translated into the intimate, defining patterns of his first week at Meadowbrook Farm. The rhythm of his captivity began at 7 each morning. Carl and two fellow prisoners, Hinrich and Wolfgang, would walk from their billet, a converted barn fitted with cots and a stove, to the main farmhouse. There, Mrs. Patterson would have tea and bread ready before her husband assigned the day's tasks. The work was hard but not impossible. It was a life of learning unfamiliar techniques, like milking cows under Mr. Patterson's patient repetition, of straightforward, if unpleasant, labor like mucking out stalls, and of following the established routines of repairing fences and feeding livestock. On the Patterson farm, a new and unexpected routine began to take shape. The proprietor, Mr. Patterson, supervised with a pragmatic and direct approach, free from micromanagement. He would demonstrate a task with precision, expect competent execution, and correct mistakes without undue criticism. His philosophy was simple: this was work that needed doing, and they were there to do it. The initial language barrier was a considerable challenge. Patterson's German was limited to basic commands, and the prisoner's English was scant. Communication became a language of its own, built from demonstration, gesture, and a slowly expanding shared vocabulary. Within a week, a rudimentary pidgin adequate for the day's tasks had emerged. For prisoners like Carl, the most profound discovery was the absence of palpable hatred. He had anticipated that British civilians would treat them with the minimum decency regulations required, but with the maximum hostility that personal grief demanded. Instead, the Pattersons were simply correct, not friendly, but never cruel. They were professional, maintaining an appropriate distance while ensuring the men had the tools and provisions to work effectively. Mrs. Patterson would bring tea during breaks, a gesture not of hospitality, but of practical refreshment. When a prisoner named Hinrich injured his hand on barbed wire, she cleaned and bandaged it with a brisk competence, never remarking on the deep irony of mending the wound of a German soldier. The days settled into a rhythm that became comfortable through its very familiarity. A 6 a.m. start with tea and bread, work until a brief lunch of bread, cheese, and cold meat, then back to the fields until 5. After years of combat, this monotony was almost restful. The work was honest, the food was adequate, and no one was shooting at them. But beyond the farm's boundaries, the presence of German prisoners of war stirred complex emotions in the Somerset villages. Some civilians were openly hostile. Mrs. Peaton, who had lost a son at Dunkirk, refused to even acknowledge their existence, crossing the street to avoid passing them. Others, like Mr. Davies, whose house, while one man, whose business in Bristol had been destroyed during the Blitz, would mutter audibly about the enemy whenever he encountered them, most villagers adopted a pragmatic acceptance. The Germans were a fact of life, providing desperately needed labor on the farms, and their conduct was disciplined. Open hostility served no purpose. Better to maintain a correct, if distant, civility. This tension played out in the village's public spaces. The landlord of the local pub was initially adamant, declaring his establishment was for British people. His righteous stand, however, quickly deflated when Mr. Patterson pointed out that the prisoners were not attempting to enter for a drink, but were merely walking past on their way from work. The church presented a different dynamic. Reverend Whitmore, an older man who had served as a chaplain in the Great War, announced that any person, German prisoners included, was welcome at Sunday services. "The Lord's house is open to all," he stated firmly. "These men are far from home. I'll not turn anyone away from God's mercy, regardless of what uniform they wore." On Easter Sunday, 1945, 3 prisoners took him at his word. They sat in the back pew and abstained from communion, but as the congregation sang "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," the prisoners joined in, their German verses harmonizing with the English. While unsettling for some, others found it profoundly moving, former enemies united in shared worship. As Mrs. Patterson later summarized the village consensus, most people were sensible about it. Yes, they'd fought for the wrong side. But being nasty to prisoners working on farms wouldn't bring anyone back. This quiet pragmatism led to a gradual loosening of restrictions that would have shocked German military sensibilities. Initially, prisoners were escorted everywhere by a Home Guard volunteer, rifle slung over the shoulder. But the Home Guard were mostly older men, and as the prisoners proved their reliability, the strictness of their supervision began to erode. By the summer of 1945, in the wake of Germany's surrender, the official protocols of war began to fray against the realities of rural life. The daily ritual of escorting German prisoners on a 3-mile walk to milk cows seemed increasingly absurd, particularly when the men showed no inclination to escape. Consequently, the escorts were discontinued. The system now hinged entirely on the prisoners' cooperation as they walked unaccompanied to their assigned farms, worked under the farmer's direction, and returned to their billets alone. As one prisoner, a man named Carl, would later recall, the decision to remain was a simple calculation. Where would we go? He reasoned. Britain was an island, and their homeland was an occupied ruin offering no sanctuary. To escape meant sacrificing security, fair treatment, and adequate food for the uncertain life of a fugitive. It made no sense. This pragmatism on the part of the prisoners was soon met by a quiet, humanizing response from their hosts. Though technically against regulations, a practice overlooked by authorities became common. Farmers began inviting prisoners into their homes for meals. Mrs. Patterson, for instance, started serving the men a proper Sunday dinner of roast, vegetables, pudding, and tea. Carl was stunned by the first invitation, asking in halting English, "You invite us to your table?" Her reply was one of characteristic British practicality. They worked hard, and it seemed mean to make them eat separately when there was room. These meals became a bridge across the recent chasm of enmity. Conversations, though limited by language, grew more comfortable, centering on the universal language of agriculture. Mr. Patterson would discuss crops and livestock. Carl would describe farming in Germany, finding commonalities. This burgeoning trust culminated in the most remarkable of gestures when Mr. Patterson taught Carl to drive and maintain the farm tractor, placing a valuable piece of machinery, and a profound level of responsibility, into the hands of a man who was, until very recently, the enemy. This burgeoning trust was demonstrated not in grand speeches, but in the quiet, daily routines of the farm. Carl, possessing peacetime mechanical training, was given unsupervised command of the tractor. When the machine broke down during plowing, he simply repaired it. Mr. Patterson's response was not praise, but something more meaningful, a simple nod, an acknowledgement of competence that transcended their roles as captor and captive. Similarly, Wolfgang, a carpenter before the war, was tasked with a major barn repair. Given only materials and a basic plan, he was left to his craft. The result was a structure of professional quality, with precise joinery that exceeded what the farmer could have done himself. Upon inspection, Mr. Patterson offered more than a nod. He extended his hand, the first time he had offered such a gesture of respect. Decades later, Carl would reflect on the profound impact of these moments. "They treated us like men," he recalled, "not like prisoners, not like enemies, but like workers whose competence they respected." For Mr. Patterson to entrust a prisoner with his tractor, the very engine of his livelihood, and for Mrs. Patterson to welcome them into her home, was a security more potent than any guard tower or barbed wire. This trust fostered a powerful reciprocity. The prisoners began to invest themselves in the farm's success. When storms threatened the harvest, they worked extra hours voluntarily. When Mr. Patterson injured his back, they managed all farm operations independently for 3 days, because the farm's welfare had become their own. This was not sentiment. It was the natural result of treating men with dignity. The Pattersons demonstrated that trust was not weakness, but an acknowledgement that circumstance, not character, had made them enemies. As English improved and familiarity grew, these unspoken understandings gave way to deeper conversations. One autumn evening in 1945, while repairing a fence, Mr. Patterson asked directly, "Why'd you fight for Hitler?" Man was obviously mad. Carl paused, choosing his words carefully. "We." On British farms, the chasm between former enemies began to close through conversations that were frank, yet devoid of accusation. German prisoners articulated the powerful narratives they had been taught, that Germany was a victim of the last war's peace, that it was defending itself against existential threats, that it was merely reclaiming its strength. For their British hosts, men like Mr. Patterson, these justifications echoed familiar refrains. He would recall his own brother, a changed man after the Great War, and reflect that German soldiers then, too, were told they were defending their homeland. While never excusing the actions that followed, this shared understanding, that soldiers are often the first instruments of a state's ideology, fostered a complex empathy. It was a recognition that while the cause may have been evil, the individuals caught in its machinery were not uniformly so. This burgeoning humanity was captured in countless small interactions. When Mrs. Patterson learned that a prisoner named Carl had a wife and daughter in the ravaged city of Hamburg, she acknowledged his unspoken burden. In a moment of profound irony, she revealed her own son was in Berlin with the Royal Engineers, helping to rebuild what the war had destroyed. Here was the war's strange symmetry laid bare, a British soldier rebuilding a German city, while a German prisoner harvested British crops. When the official repatriation of prisoners began in 1946, it presented a daunting choice. For many, Germany was a terrifying prospect, a nation of ruined cities, a collapsed economy, and a traumatized society. In response, British authorities offered continued employment to those willing to stay as civilian agricultural workers. Approximately 25,000 former prisoners accepted. Carl was among them. With his family's Hamburg apartment destroyed and his wife and daughter struggling in the countryside, the offer was a lifeline he could not refuse. The offer from Mr. Patterson represented more than just continued farm employment. It was a bridge from a captive past to a civilian future. It promised actual wages, not a prisoner's stipend, money that could be saved, sent home to a shattered Germany, and eventually used to help his family rebuild. For Mr. Patterson, the arrangement was pragmatic. He would retain an experienced, reliable worker who knew the rhythms of the farm, rather than gamble on an unknown. For Carl Hoffman, the acceptance was life-altering. The transition from prisoner to employee was a quiet metamorphosis, marked by small changes of immense symbolic weight. Carl moved from the communal austerity of the converted barn into a proper cottage on the property. He was no longer a ward of the state, but a free man, treated as a colleague. The work remained the same, but its context had been utterly transformed. This was a bond that would endure. Carl Hoffman remained at Meadowbrook Farm for 3 years, finally returning to Germany in 1949. He left with his saved wages, letters of reference from the Pattersons, and the conflicted feelings of leaving people who had become akin to family. Their departure at the railway station was one of quiet dignity, firm handshakes, a packed lunch, and the unspoken emotion in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. Their subsequent correspondence, spanning decades, documented a friendship built on mutual respect. Carl wrote of his work rebuilding Hamburg's infrastructure and his daughter's education. The Pattersons shared news of the farm and the slow return to normalcy in post-war Britain. When Carl's daughter married in 1965, a telegram arrived from Meadowbrook Farm. Carl framed it, displaying it in his home as tangible evidence that former enemies could become friends. While Carl rebuilt his life in Germany, others, like the carpenter Wolfgang, remained in Britain permanently. He married a British woman, settled in Somerset, and raised children who grew up British, yet knew their German heritage, another life remade by the unexpected connections forged in wartime. Not all prisoners of war returned home. For some, the years of captivity forged unexpected bonds, creating small communities of Germans who found new lives in the country they had once fought. In 1977, when his former employer, Mr. Patterson, died at the age of 83, a man named Carl Hoffman made the journey from Germany back to England. He stood in the same small parish church where, as a captive, he had once sung hymns in his native German. Now, a free man, he sang them in English, a mourner for the farmer who had offered him fairness when cruelty would have been understandable. Afterwards, Patterson's widow grasped his hand, repeating her husband's long-held sentiment, He always said you were the best worker he'd ever hired. This quiet, poignant moment encapsulates a wider, defining aspect of the British wartime conduct. The decision to employ prisoners on farms was born not of generosity, but of stark necessity, a pragmatic response to critical labour shortages. Yet the implementation of this policy was a deliberate reflection of national values, restrained, practical, and committed to maintaining standards. This approach served a threefold purpose. Practically, it kept the nation's food production going. Strategically, it served as a quiet demonstration of democratic civilization's moral superiority, a victory won through action, not propaganda. And morally, it preserved the British self-conception as a people who adhered to decency, even toward a defeated enemy. For the German prisoners, steeped in ideology that depicted Britain as weak and corrupt, the impact was profound. They encountered a society whose strength was rooted in principle, and whose civilization proved more durable than the Thousand-Year Reich. Carl Hoffman summarized the experience decades later. The British defeated us militarily, but they defeated us more completely by treating us fairly when they didn't have to. They showed us what civilization actually means. Not the racial mysticism and power worship the Nazis called civilization, but genuine respect for human dignity, even in an enemy. That lesson, learned on an English farm, taught me more about how society should function than 12 years of Nazi education ever did.